Well, thank you both for that kind introduction. It's always strange kind of listening to other people introducing when one's standing in front of a company like this. It almost feels like a frame starts to appear around your body as you speak. I start quite formally in a sense because I have to give thanks to the Kunstmuseum Luzern for enabling me to spend this time with you to share some of the thoughts about the work that I've been undertaking with my colleagues Andrew Dewdney and Victoria Walsh over the past 5 years. My thanks also go to Nora Landkammer for helping me get here in one piece, and also to both Nora and Ursula Lerko for their stunning work of translation, because unfortunately, although this is my second visit to Switzerland, my German is no better than it was during my first. So I'm very much grateful to both of you for enabling me to participate in this very rich day of discussion and activity. And I have a sense that people have been working through a number of the ideas which have been presented in this project. And particularly in relation to your talk, Carmen, there were a number of ideas which I know you and I have discussed over a long period of time, which have been brought to a point of crystallization, I think, through this project coming to this point. And it's very much in respect of crystallization of ideas that I want to speak to you this evening. Because in relation to Tate Encounters, we've reached a point of crystallization of a thinking process that has taken quite a long time. And it has brought us to a turning point. And I think that at times such as these, turning points, whether it's the turning point in the day, such as the turning point that we're undergoing now, or the turning point that comes at the end of a project, such as the end of the project that you've been undertaking and the end of the project that I've been undertaking, there does have to be a period of reflection, a period of some thinking and some quiet contemplation about what we have learned so far. And it's very much in relation to what we have learned so far that I want to talk to you this evening. One of the things that I think we need to constantly return to at the end of our activities and our intellectual labour, because it is labour, it is work to generate these ideas. One of the things that we need to return to is asking ourselves exactly where we are. This is a question of reorientation, beginning to understand again what our bearings are after the work that we've undertaken. And as Salman Rushdie very famously pointed out in his novel, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, the term orientation contains the term orient. So orientation, in a sense, is about refinding the East. And if I may, I quite literally will return to our refinding the East by turning to this comment by Tate Encounters, who is the director of the National Library and Archive in Baghdad. This experience of this man who was brought very much to our attention some 5 years ago in terms of his own team's insistence that they would return to their place of work despite the fact it had been bombed, that it was still a theatre of war, that he and his team would return to that side of work in order to continue the work of cultural production. And for me, this is a reorientation, because as this quote, which I won't read out because you can read it yourself, but as this quote shows, there's a question about culture and struggle and what one is prepared to fight for. And it's that which Tate Encounters returns us to in relation to the struggles that have taken place in Iraq. Now, this is not Iraq. We're very far from theatres of war here in Switzerland, and of course part of Switzerland's own definition is the questions about the distance it produces politically, a political and conceptual distance from the theatres of war. But equally, in relation to the UK is not Iraq. And the UK equally has its own political questions about where it is situated in relation to theatres of war in which it is today, as we speak, involved. So that reorientation is as much about asking what is happening over there as it is about what is happening here. And part of that question of what is happening here is a remembering, which is part of reorientation, a recollection, a bringing back together of the constituent parts of what define us, the geopolitical dimension of the work that we undertake every day. Here, Western Europe, we are embedded, our work is embedded in the work of advanced neoliberal societies. We are affected, as we know, every day, as we speak, by the effects of technologization, globalization. The information age and its demands have been part of the discussions that I've taken part in today. The discussions which were led by Micro-Sillon and which were attended by many of the faces that I see in this room, where again there were the discussions about what do we do in response to the demand for information, the demand that we should give knowledge. How do we undo that positioning that is given to us when we are in mediation situations and information is asked of us? Of course, it's said that information is not knowledge. Data is not knowledge. And that relationship between information and knowledge is something that we must continually rethink, particularly in relation to moments where information itself is beginning to change. So it's in relation to that changing landscape, that changing backdrop, that I want to talk to you about the work that I've been undertaking, as I said, with my colleagues over the past 5 years. And that changing backdrop, if you like, invites us to rethink the analytical categories, the way in which we think about our ideas, the ways in which we ask and reformulate our questions. This is something that we are invited to rethink. This is something that we're invited to reconsider. And it is that change. It's a change that we are undergoing in relation to the specific geopolitics of the UK. But I'm hoping in discussing this with you here this evening that you will find resonances with the turning points which are being undergone here in Switzerland. Of course, the turning points are different. The specificities are different. They have to be. But it's that question of how we continually return to the specificities of our work that is the thing that we're invited to do. In relation to Tate Encounters then, there are a number of questions that we're invited to think to help us understand the turning point that our learning had done over that period of time in relation to the major ways in which we thought about what it was that we were doing, what it was that was being undertaken in learning, education, and mediation practices every day. And the privilege of being able to take a step back, and the privilege of these kinds of situations where we can reflect on work that we're undertaking every day, is something that in a sense becomes something that we have to take as highly significant. So in relation to that then, I want to, over the next 30 minutes or so, talk about the changes in the kinds of questions that we were beginning to ask in relation to Tate Encounters. And some of them, certainly for myself, became quite challenging in terms of understanding my own intellectual labour and the history of my intellectual labour over the past 10, 15, or 20 years. One of the shifts that we were invited to consider was the shift from thinking about coherent social entities, cities, nations, collectives, identities, groups, whether they be groups of British Africans based in London, whether they be groups of gays and lesbians, whether they be groups of young people, whether they be groups of elder people, whether they be the groups that have been part of the history of change, which has gone alongside some of the transformations that Carmen spoke about in her talk within the professional field, the changes, the social change which have gone alongside those. These are things that we've had to begin to ask our question of how useful was it to continue thinking in those terms. The notion of a coherent social identity, a coherent social entity, how useful was that in comparison to another term that emerged as a part of our work, which was the importance of emergent networks. Emergent networks, about which I'll speak a little more later, but emergent networks which speak again to an important thing that is characterizing contemporary experience, which is of course the question of technology, the question of reaching into your pocket and ensuring that your mobile phone is switched off so you don't interrupt a talk from a keynote speaker. The question of the technology, which is of course enabling me to speak and now, but perhaps also speak to people in time to come. So those emergent networks, how important they become to understanding our practice and what we do every day, these were key questions which came forward. A second set of questions, a set of challenges if you like, was the challenge to the notion of collective action. A notion again, which for me spoke to, if you like, the foundations of both my political and professional life, and certainly in relation to Western Europe, collective action, whether that be in relation to industrial action, in relation to different kinds of social gendered actions. These have been centres of the way that Western Europe understands itself. We tried to think about collective action in relation to the museum, and certainly in the context of the UK, understanding the field of cultural production could not be taken forward without an understanding of collective action. But one of the things that the knowledge forced us to begin to think about was how useful was the notion of collective action in comparison to another idea which emerged in relation to us, which was the notion of the dissociative function. And what I mean by that is the way within institutions, the way in which different kinds of knowledge and expertise begin to separate out and begin to extend across the boundary of the institution to link with other institutions, both nationally, internationally, establishing the global. So in a sense what we begin to talk about is how far, in the way that we work every day, we need to start thinking about the kinds of connections that we're making within a professional field, within a body of knowledge which is being established globally. And how far those kinds of affiliations are more important or more salient than the ideas of collective action, in the ways that we've understood them hitherto, in the ways of understanding them in relation to the collective action that we might take up around our city space, or around our urban space, even around our national space. The third move that we were invited to make was again equally challenging. It was one in terms of thinking about the integrated structure of the museum. And I certainly have an affinity with those who might find this idea difficult, because I myself find it a very challenging idea. Part of the work that has been undertaken in the move from education to learning, even the more historic moves from, if you like, the museum guides, literally the people who used to be their guides, to speak to people at the door as they came into the museum, to the development of an education department within a museum, to the development of gallery education, to the development of learning, to the development of co-production. All these ideas, the history of these ideas, have depended on a notion of some kind of integrated structure. That the work that we do, that the thinking that goes on in this room, would have an effect in the executive suites of the museum, would have an effect amongst the curators, would have an effect on the collections. To start to ask ourselves how useful it was to continue thinking in those terms was challenging indeed. And we moved to starting to ask ourselves, what happens if we take seriously, again, the knowledge that we're receiving, the things that we're observing, about the disaggregation that actually takes place within the museum? And what I mean by that is not the museum as this integrated thing where there's communication directly from one department to another, where there's an understanding of what happens in the project space in this room, the work that Christoph Lange did in relation to the collection displays for the new acquisitions from 2000 to 2010, about which we heard earlier today. What happens if there actually isn't the connection that we claim, that we think, or even that the rhetoric of the museum tells us? What actually happens if it's more important to understand the disconnection? If it's more important to understand the things that stop those discussions circulating? If it's more important to understand the ways in which these discussions actually do circulate within a particular body of knowledge, which includes the people in this room. If that is the reality of what's going on, not what we might claim or want or hope, but that's the reality of what is going on, isn't it more useful for us to begin to think about that category, that reality, and to see where we go from there? It starts from where we are. The next toughie for me was the question of political action. And I have to say it was only political action that actually brought me to where I am today. It was an excellent resume, and I can say it's excellent because I wrote part of it, but that excellent resume, political action played a massive part. And I can't talk to you about the number of marches I've been on, the number of demonstrations, the number of times that in relation to the museum, in relation to galleries, trying to get people who I have seen in conservative positions to understand the positions that we were taking. That political action was at the heart of what I've done in terms of my understanding of myself as a political being, and the number of affiliations I've made internationally with people I know have been committed, and that word commitment is at the centre of things, committed to the kinds of things in which I believed. To begin to ask myself how far I need to set aside political action in order to spend time understanding the work of policy and policy operations, that was a difficult journey to take. Because by looking at the question of policy operation, and understand the ways in which political action gets reformulated into policy, and the ways in which political action takes a different form once policy begins to become formulated, what is gained and lost in that translation? These are important questions for us to ask, and it may mean setting aside political action, or if you like, bracketing off, difficult term, but bracketing off and setting aside political action in order to understand and look at and analyse more fully policy operation. So all in all, I wrapped this up into a kind of unholy mess, if you like, which summed up in this term of moving from social contribution and the importance of social contribution to what we are doing, the narratives and the legitimated narratives of what we do, to thinking about the importance of network distribution. How far does that move characterise the ways in which we're actually working, the field of operation that we're involved in today? So that move, which is really at the heart of what is coming out of Tate Encounters, was there to ask, how is it that a specific and detailed account of what we do, of our working practices, what is it that an account of what we actually do will give, what will it deliver? Just for those of you who don't know, I'm sure there are many who don't know, about Tate Encounters, I should say to you it was an extended case study which took place over 5 years, was a collaboration between the University of the Arts London, London South Bank University and Tate Britain itself, which was funded by a research council in the UK, the HRC. Myself and 2 of my colleagues, Andrew Jude and Victoria Walsh, worked on this question about the archive of national identity. So it started off as a question which was very much situated within what one might see as a conventional legitimation, a conventional rationale for why a national museum might exist. The sense of working for the nation, working for the public, keeping the national treasures, defending national sovereignty. All of these ideas, which were very telling and have been so across Europe over the past years. And we can see them in relation to transnational moves like the extension of Schengen. And I was noted how Switzerland's complex relationship to Schengen and these transnational movements, the relationship to Schengen and the relationship to the EU are 2 very complex things that Switzerland, I know, negotiates constantly, so politically. But how far that then fits in with the ways in which national identity is articulated, these are major questions. And the museums, of course, play their part through this question about what it is, the rationale for the museum, why people feel that they do the work that they do, what is the basis of their commitment. Tate, and I can give you this quotation from Tate's mission statement, says, I quote, "Tate's mission is to increase the public's knowledge, understanding and enjoyment of British art from the 16th century to the present day, and of international modern and contemporary art. Education, awareness building, and even pleasure. All in the name of the nation." You could ask for anything more. The study, of course, analysed all of those questions, analysed the question of Tate's historic mission. And what we began to do was to actually analyse the organisational structure, to analyse the vehicle, the machine, which was there to deliver this mission. And it was quite revealing what happened as we developed this analysis. I just wanted to show you there over these next couple of slides here what the disciplinary background to Tate Encounters was. But really what I wanted to do was to show the ways in which the thinking, the disciplines, helped us go beyond the view that the museum had about its role and its relationship to the public. So in relation to these questions, and of course things like anthropology and social science and new media were important tools that we used in our study, because there were ways in which we were able to speak directly across the museum to the people whose working practice it was to deliver on these mission statements. And it's constantly part, if you like, of the discourse, both of art education, but particularly art education, mediation, interpretation, as well as curatorial discourses, which is the separation between the theoretical and the practical, the theoretical and what is done every day. So it's in relation to trying to ask ourselves what is done every day that we began to unpick, if you like, some of the different claims that were made for what was done every day. These are just outlines of how we went about looking and asking about what is done every day. I'm not going on too far about that. We can all look at that in relation to the Tate Encounters website. I think it's more important for us to think about what the study actually delivered, and for that to then feed into our own thinking of what we do every day. So part of that unpicking of the claim of what was done every day was the unpicking of the idea about a relationship to Britain and to public, to the public culture of Britain. Because it turned out, interestingly, during our study of Tate Britain, that the term British had absolutely no operational value. And what I mean by that, well, I'm sure you know, what I mean by that is that at no point within the organisation, when we asked people in different roles, in different positions, actually, what is British, what is Britain, there was no definitive answer. Even the term public, which is used in terms of the public mission of Tate, the term public seems to have a very limited value. And I have to say, it turned out time and time again that the public were basically visitors to the institution who were not contracted staff. That is the public. That is the operational definition of the public. So once we actually deal with what's happening rather than what's claimed to be happening, we begin to move onto quite a different terrain. And looking at that terrain and seeing that terrain as a starting point becomes, I think, a very useful thing. So what became significant then, in relation to those questions, was the change of terms, moving away from this term, which is again what I call a legitimizing term, the term which gives a rationale for why people do the work that they do, this term, the public. Actually, in practice, there were a series of other terms which were far more important and were terms that professionals used every day. Terms such as social demographics, terms such as core and marginal audiences, terms such as target groups. These were the terms that people were using. These were the terms which were meaningful to people. These were the terms which appeared in people's annual evaluations, their reviews. These were the things that got people promotion and got people sacked. Not public, demographics, not British, core, marginal audience. Not Great Britain, but target group. We've got to ask ourselves about what is meaningful every day. The other interesting point was that many of these significant categories were subject to this separation, this, what I term this complex word, disaggregation, this separating out. So this idea that there is this one big audience, one great public that the museum served, this idea very quickly fell away to an understanding that, in fact, the ways in which interactions with the museum worked were very segmented, very separated out. There were different people who came to the museum for different reasons, who were invited to the museum for different points, for different events, and even entered the museum through different doors. I'm not joking. So, if you like, this separation, this dissociation, points again to the redundancy, if you like, of this term social collective, public, and actually points towards looking and investigating the meaning of dissociations. What happens as people are marshalled through different doors, are asked to come to the museum at different times of day. Who is in the museum at 8:05 in the evening, and who isn't? Dissociative networks. Networks, they are networks, but they dissociate from other networks. These are the working practices, these are the operations, these are the things that we need to understand. There are a few other points here. I'm going to mention just a couple more because, of course, I think you're getting the tenor of where this argument is going. But I will mention a couple more just because it helps us understand, I think in more detail, what is happening in relation to these practices. I think one of the useful things for us to think about, particularly the people in this room, is in relation to the ways in which these networks actually operate. The separation and distinction between these networks, in a sense, they undo the rhetoric, but they actually deliver something else. One of the interesting things about the study was it showed that the network actually cut across the institutional space. That the network formed itself in relation to the different people within the institution who were connected to its interests and its affiliations, but people outside the institution, and as I said, people globally. So to understand how the global network is actually sustained, what the global network actually delivers, and how that global network perpetuates itself, these are all important questions for us to ask over and above whatever institutional affiliation one may or may not have. And one of the key questions that we were asking is, what was happening? How did people understand what was needed to further the interests of the network? We looked, of course, at what we would call the education network. And one of the interesting things that came out of this analysis, which we kind of, this tabulation, this table here, helps you look at what came out of this analysis, is that we saw that within the institution there was breaks, if you like, between the networks, and certain networks were assigned particular things to do, had particular languages, and interfaced differently with those outside the museum. So if you like, I mean, it doesn't need to be kind of hierarchical in this way, it could be turned another way, this table. It doesn't matter. The point about the table is the separation. And you have here educators, learning, mediation, in a network with embodied audiences, in a network with marketing and interpretation, with the role of propagating cultural value. You have also, in a separate network, the curators and the conservators, whose role is in relation not to public, but to objects. And their role is in relation to developing a certain language around objects and certain kinds of affiliations around securing those objects and maintaining those objects. And what is important to reiterate is the way that that is separated categorically from other work. And similarly, another separation is in relation to those that underwrite cultural value, in relation to acquisitions and those who deal with donations, sponsorship, patronage. So you have these different, and of course it can be a much more complex picture as you begin to make it much finer, but you see these separations in relation to the networks within the museum. And what we found was it would be more interesting, rather than to look at a table like this, but to take tables of lots of different institutional structures and actually put those networks together and actually talk about the way that those networks themselves operate independently of the other networks. And that will begin to tell us something very interesting. Think, for instance, within the education networks, the ways in which links are made with other academics. And again, I referred to Christoph Wanger's talk earlier today to talk to us about the way that this becomes a very useful, interesting and decisive way in which the learning, educational, mediation network develops itself by forming these relationships with schools, with school pupils, with students, with universities, and to think about what populates that network and why those subjects populate that network. What kind of intersubjective space is it that we're dealing with and that we're going to perpetuate, that we're going to grow? These are the questions that become much more useful for us to think about, rather than the reiteration of the interests of the institution. I won't say too much about the curatorial network because we know very much about the curatorial network, and I know that curatorial networks work differently in different institutions, only to say that at Tate, the curatorial network lent very much towards a connoisseurial model of curatorship, which may or may not surprise people who know that particular institution. and the ways in which, if you like, the connoisseurial drive within curatorial networks is something that needs to be taken account of. Equally, the marketing network is something that I won't talk about in too much detail, because I'm sure, again, people understand the way that that works. But only to say that, of course, within marketing, the development of different professional affiliations moves many marketing people to speak a different language to the language which is spoken across the museum. So the links, of course, with kind of press and media outlets are there in order to constitute a particular way of thinking about that particular work. That is that network. Now, of course, I'm not questioning the legitimacy of these networks. In fact, what I'm saying is these are the things which are happening, and in fact, these are the things to which we must pay attention if we want to attend to change, to the changes which are taking place. So the function of the different networks then produces these different languages, marketing, segmented audiences, curators, experts and connoisseurs, and within learning, education and media we have these languages around targeting demographic groups. Okay. So if we're thinking about the changes in these terms of analysis, these changes which will help us begin to rethink what is actually happening, what's taking place in our work every day, we need to attend to the politics and the ways in which that becomes changed. The political terrain gets slightly shifted. We heard earlier in Carmen's talk about one aspect of that political terrain in relation to institutional critique and the whole range of artists, practitioners, activists who were involved in the institutional critique, Hans Harker, Fred Wilson, many others, who were involved in moving forward a particular set of politics around museum and gallery practices of spectatorship and display. There was also in the UK, and I'm not sure about the question here in Switzerland, in the UK there's a massive cultural critique, of course, that also came from the Black Arts movement. People like Rashid Areen and Eddie Chambers were very important in generating a critique of museums in terms of talking about whose interests were the museums serving. And of course there was reference to the Guerrilla Girls who asked similar questions about whose interests museums were serving. So a series of these questions added to an academic critique which came out of the new museology, critical museology, about which we heard earlier, to ask questions about the politics of museums, the politics of collection and the politics of display. In trying to understand what happened in the intervening decades between, let's say, the 1970s, as these ideas started to become fully formulated through the 80s, 90s, up to the present, we begin to ask ourselves about the questions of policy. Primary.
Einfach das andere. Zwei.
Take a sip of water.
Hält es?
Did I?
Yeah.
I'll give you a quick aside that in a former life, I used to sing and I used to dance. And one of the hardest things about singing is microphone technique. And that handheld, it's the worst of all.
Yes, he's enjoying it.
Why should I try to make my life easier now and change the habit of a lifetime? And perhaps it was because I was talking about politics.
Censorship.
But I quite rightly got cut off. There are, of course, advantages to a handheld mic, which, of course, that one has a sense of freedom of movement. And, of course, one might talk about that in relation to a political backdrop that we're all facing, talking about in Europe at the moment. Questions about freedom of movement and borders, borderlessness, opening of borders. These questions about politics that get reformulated constantly, how they get formulated in terms of policy, is a series of questions that we had to ask in Tate Encounters. And what was telling for us was the ways in which the people who were responsible for the politics as such, responding to literally to the politicians, to the ministers, and the kinds of directives which are coming from the ministries. Those people, the executives, the directors, developed particular mechanisms by which certain parts of the institution were protected from the politics, which meant that other parts of the institution were exposed. And perhaps you could guess which was which. That kind of institutional dynamic is something that we need to pay attention to, that we need to name, and something that we need to understand in relation, again, to our own intellectual labour. Because working within mediation, working across the development from education and learning to mediation, means that we become more exposed to questions of politics in order to protect others from those very questions. Which means that those questions actually become intensified because there's an institutional practice taking place, which is concentrating those questions in one part of the institution in order that other parts of the institution do not respond. What happens in relation to people's working practices, how people deal with that, how people respond to that in their everyday practices, what the affective content of that labour is something that actually also needs to be addressed. So in moving, again, from looking at the politics to looking at what happens within an institution and addressing, again, our own labour, our affective labour, the affective content of our labour, becomes an important question to address. And how and where that affective content sits in our professional practices is a question that I think we need to take away. Because how and who in this room would be able to say to their museum director, well, I need some time off because that particular exhibition which you put on because of whatever political pressure you had from the minister had this many people come to it and say this many things to me about whether I should or should not be putting on this exhibition, asking me whether this was or wasn't art, asking me about who or who I didn't think I am. Dealing with the public, I think the directors call it. And I say, what public? I have people coming to the museum asking me about questions about why this is on the wall. And they're not sometimes that polite. And if they are polite, they're polite in a very particular way. This is the affective content of our own labour, and this is something that does need to be named. This is something that needs to be thought of in relation to what we do every day. So the final and I think most challenging for me questions do come around this politics, policy, what is actually happening. Let's leave the rhetoric aside and look at how things are actually being dealt with. That's where a lot of these questions come to me. And this question about the shift from contribution to distribution is perhaps one of the most thorny. And I'm not sure that in terms of putting this to you, that it will come out particularly clearly. So please let me give you that caveat. The way I'm going to try to, if you like, elucidate it or look at it is in relation to, again, one of the key formulations of the museum, which is this notion of contribution. Okay? That somehow there is a contribution that is made for the common good, for the sake of culture. Contributions which are the basis of collections. People make donations, literally, of objects that they once possessed. People give donations of money or sponsorship, which enable, museums to acquire things which were once possessed by somebody else or some other institution. This is the model of contribution. And in English, I'm not sure if it translates into German, but in English we have this wonderful phrase, to pay a visit, which also has this sense, or underlines the sense that visitors are making a contribution to the museum. They make the contribution, which is, if you like, the recognition of the museum as the producer of cultural value. That the museum and its expertise, of which we are a part, produce, reify, make real, the sense that the things that it is doing and the things that it possesses has cultural value. Okay? So around that, there is a sense in which there is a shift that we need to think about in relation to, well, what is this contribution? How is this contribution actually made, and what does it deliver? And how far are the aspects of the museum which are not necessarily working towards contribution, but actually are more interested in distribution? And again, we go back to this understanding that the museum doesn't exist. There are several museums at work, constantly, working with different expertise and with different aims. And although some parts of the museum might be invested in the notion of contribution, of course, people working in development, donors, sponsorship will always talk about contribution that's being made and the contribution the museum makes. But then there are other parts of the museum, and particularly this is very much the case in the United Kingdom. Again, you would be able to tell me more clearly how far this works within the Swiss context, which are interested and invested in distribution, are invested in ensuring that the image and the intellectual content that the museum has is distributed globally across a global network. And that comes through reproduction, through online, through a whole series of merchandising, a whole series of aspects of museum activity which are part of the museum's work every day. So, moving towards my conclusion, one of the things that I want us to think about in relation to all these moves away from the coherent social entity, that idea, to the idea of the emergent network, away from thinking about collective action to think about dissociative functions, away from thinking about the museum as an integrated structure to think about disaggregated models, away from political action to think about policy operations, away from social contributions to network distributions. All of these moves, which are challenging, that take some work, the question has to be what does it offer? And as we go into our weekend and thinking about returning to work on Monday, where I think some of the questions all day that we've been thinking about will percolate slowly and come out in the work and practice from Monday onwards, we have to ask ourselves, what does this offer? And so I return to the question that I started with, which is what really have we learned? What have we learned so far? The change in these significant terms, the idea that we need to move to a detailed account of what we actually do, rather than thinking about the claims that are made for what we do, to better understand and what aims they are, to better understand the conditions under which transformation is undergone. Transformation, I know, is a key word within both working practice and the discourse. And I do want to invite us to think through what are the conditions under which it is undergone. And part of that move is to let go, for a time, of the idea that transformative action is the work of self-conscious political agents, that it's about something that I do or you do, that it's about something that we become invested in. And instead start to think about transformative action as a process of recognition. To be thinking about how we can take steps to recognize that change is always already taking place. To recognize that and to see where we are in that already. And I'll end on this point, which for me is perhaps the sums up where this kind of thinking takes me in relation to questions of mediation. And I do think it is a problematic space to be, but let's end with a problem, because we have time to think it through. To think about transformative mediation.
Brilliant.
Am I being sabotaged?
Friday night.
Really great.
Leads us to some conspiracy.
The show goes on. Yeah, I guess this is the final thought, really. And it is a thought, but I'm not sure what it will become. To think about what are the steps that we need to take to recognize that the position of not knowing, it's unsustainable. Nothing, no one can remain in a place of not knowing. So what role do we play in that shift from not knowing to knowing? Thank you very much.